Jake Morrison had been standing in line for what felt like hours, watching alien after alien pass through the genetic scanners at the Galactic Academy Admissions Center. The line moved slowly, snaking through the massive hall like a multicolored river of beings from across the known galaxy. Some aliens had tentacles. Others had scales or feathers or crystalline bodies that caught the light in beautiful ways. A few didn't even have solid forms, floating in containment fields that hummed softly as they drifted forward. Jake tried not to stare, but it was hard. Even after 20 years of Earth being part of the galactic community, seeing this many different species in one place still took his breath away. Back home in Nevada, the most exotic thing he'd seen was a Centaurian exchange student at his high school. Here, surrounded by hundreds of beings from worlds he'd only read about, Jake felt very small and very human. The genetic scanning process was supposed to be simple and routine. Every prospective student had to go through it before being accepted to the academy. The scanners analyzed your DNA to determine your aptitude for different fields of study, identified any potential health issues, and assessed your genetic compatibility with the various learning environments the academy offered. Most species had specific needs, some required different atmospheric conditions, others needed particular gravity levels, and a few couldn't be in the same room as certain other species without getting sick. Jake had done his research. The scan took about 30 seconds on average. The student would step into the booth, a blue light would sweep over them from head to toe, and then a cheerful chime would sound to indicate completion. The admissions officer would review the results, stamp some forms, and the student would be on their way to the next stage of enrollment. Simple. Quick. Nothing to worry about. Jake watched the alien ahead of him complete their scan without incident. The being looked like a walking tree with bark-like skin and branches instead of arms. The blue light swept over them, the chime sounded, and they moved on. The admissions officer, a four-armed insectoid whose name badge read Clark, gestured for Jake to step forward. "Next, please," Clark said in perfectly accented Standard Galactic. His compound eyes reflected the overhead lights as he typed something on his terminal with two hands while the other two prepared the scanner. Jake stepped up to the booth, trying to look more confident than he felt. The booth was made of some kind of translucent material that glowed faintly. Inside, there was just enough room for him to stand comfortably with his arms at his sides. Sensors lined the walls, tiny dots of technology that would be reading every cell in his body in just a few moments. "Step inside and remain still," Clark instructed, his mandibles clicking slightly as he spoke. "The scan will take approximately 30 seconds. Do not move until you hear the completion signal." Jake nodded and stepped into the booth. The door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss, and he was suddenly very aware of how quiet it was inside. The sounds of the busy admissions center were muted, leaving him alone with just the hum of the machinery. The scan began immediately. A line of blue light appeared at his feet and began to rise slowly, sweeping up his body like a photocopier scanning a document. Jake held his breath, watching the light climb past his knees, his waist, his chest. It was warm but not uncomfortable, tingling slightly as it passed over his skin. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The light reached his shoulders, then his neck, then his head. Jake waited for the cheerful chime that would signal completion, already thinking about what came next in the enrollment process. He needed to find the housing office, get his dorm assignment, maybe grab some food from one of the campus cafeterias that supposedly served dishes from 50 different worlds. But the chime didn't come. Instead, the blue light froze. It was halfway through scanning his head when it just stopped moving, holding position like someone had pressed pause on a video. Jake's smile faded. That wasn't supposed to happen. He glanced toward the door of the booth, wondering if he should say something or just wait. Then the light changed color. Blue shifted to red in an instant, bathing the inside of the booth in crimson illumination that made Jake's heart start pounding. Red meant something was wrong. Red meant error. Red meant problem. And then the alarms started. They weren't subtle warning beeps. These were full-volume, ear-splitting sirens that made Jake flinch and cover his ears. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the admission center and probably audible for half a mile in every direction. Through the translucent walls of the booth, Jake could see aliens spinning around in surprise, their conversations cutting off mid-sentence as everyone tried to figure out what was happening. The door of the scanner booth remained locked. Jake tried pushing on it, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped inside with red light swirling around him and alarms screaming loud enough to wake the dead. Jake nodded and stepped into the booth. The door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss, and he was suddenly very aware of how quiet it was inside. The sounds of the busy admissions center were muted, leaving him alone with just the hum of the machinery. The scan began immediately. A line of blue light appeared at his feet and began to rise slowly, sweeping up his body like a photocopier scanning a document. Jake held his breath, watching the light climb past his knees, his waist, his chest. It was warm but not uncomfortable, tingling slightly as it passed over his skin. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The light reached his shoulders, then his neck, then his head. Jake waited for the cheerful chime that would signal completion, already thinking about what came next in the enrollment process. He needed to find the housing office, get his dorm assignment, maybe grab some food from one of the campus cafeterias that supposedly served dishes from 50 different worlds. But the chime didn't come. Instead, the blue light froze. It was halfway through scanning his head when it just stopped moving, holding position like someone had pressed pause on a video. Jake's smile faded. That wasn't supposed to happen. He glanced toward the door of the booth, wondering if he should say something or just wait. Then the light changed color. Blue shifted to red in an instant, bathing the inside of the booth in crimson illumination that made Jake's heart start pounding. Red meant something was wrong. Red meant error. Red meant problem. And then the alarms started. They weren't subtle warning beeps. These were full-volume, ear-splitting sirens that made Jake flinch and cover his ears. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the admission center and probably audible for half a mile in every direction. Through the translucent walls of the booth, Jake could see aliens spinning around in surprise, their conversations cutting off mid-sentence as everyone tried to figure out what was happening. The door of the scanner booth remained locked. Jake tried pushing on it, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped inside with red light swirling around him and alarms screaming loud enough to wake the dead. "Hey!" Jake shouted, banging on the door with his fist. "Something's wrong with your scanner. Let me out." But nobody seemed to be listening to him. Through the booth's walls, Jake could see security officers rushing toward him from every direction. They weren't walking quickly, they were running at full sprint, their weapons drawn and their faces showing levels of alarm that made Jake's stomach drop. What the hell was happening? What had the scanner found? Clark, the admissions officer, was staring at his terminal screen with all four of his hands frozen in mid-motion. His compound eyes were wide, his mandibles hanging open in an expression that Jake couldn't quite read but definitely recognized as shock. Maybe horror. Definitely not the calm, professional demeanor the officer had shown moments before. More security arrived, forming a semicircle around Jake's booth with their weapons, some kind of energy rifles that hummed with barely contained power, all pointed in his general direction. Not directly at him yet, but close enough that the message was clear. Jake raised his hands slowly, pressing them against the translucent walls of the booth. "I don't know what's wrong," he called out, his voice barely audible over the continuing alarms. "The scanner just stopped working. I didn't do anything." One of the security officers, a massive being that looked like it was made of living rock, spoke into a communication device on his wrist. Jake couldn't hear what was being said over the noise, but he caught snippets. Unprecedented reading. Can't be accurate. Contact higher authority immediately. Clark had finally moved, all four of his hands now frantically typing on his terminal. Windows were opening and closing on his screen faster than Jake could track them. The officer was pulling up files, cross-referencing data, checking and rechecking something that clearly didn't make sense to him. Then, on the massive display screen that hung above the admissions center, the screen that was visible to everyone in the huge waiting area, the screen that hundreds of aliens were now staring at with growing confusion and concern, text appeared. It was written in Standard Galactic, the common language that everyone in the galaxy used for official communications. The letters were huge, taking up the entire screen, glowing in angry red that matched the light still pulsing inside Jake's booth. Genetic anomaly detected. Primordial genome markers identified. Protocol Omega initiated. Contact Imperial Authority immediately. Jake read the words 3 times, and they still didn't make any sense to him. Genetic anomaly? Primordial genome? Protocol Omega? What did any of that mean? And why did it require contacting Imperial Authority? The Emperor himself only got involved in matters of galactic security and major diplomatic incidents, not routine student admissions. The waiting area had gone completely silent except for the alarms. Every single alien in the room was staring at either the screen or at Jake, their expressions ranging from shock to fear to something that looked disturbingly like religious awe. Some of the aliens had backed away from his booth, putting distance between themselves and whatever dangerous thing the scanner had apparently found inside him. Jake pressed his face against the translucent wall, trying to catch Clark's attention. "What's happening? What did it find? I'm just human. There's nothing special about my DNA." But Clark wasn't looking at him. The admissions officer was now speaking urgently into his own communication device, his voice high and stressed in a way that suggested this situation was way above his pay grade. More security kept arriving, forming multiple layers of armed guards around Jake's position. Some were setting up what looked like portable barriers, creating a defensive perimeter. Others had scanners and detection equipment, sweeping the area as if they expected an attack at any moment. Within just 5 minutes of the alarm starting, the entire Galactic Academy Admissions Center had gone into full lockdown. Blast doors were sliding closed over the exits. Energy shields were activating around key areas. The hundreds of prospective students who'd been waiting in line were being evacuated through emergency exits by staff who looked barely less panicked than the students themselves. And Jake Morrison, 19-year-old human from Earth who just wanted to study engineering, stood trapped in a scanner booth surrounded by enough firepower to level a small city, all of it pointed at him. The guards had grabbed Tom within seconds of his hand closing around the energy whip. They came from all directions at once, 5 massive security officers who pulled him away from Lord Victor and slammed him face first onto the polished stone floor hard enough to knock the wind out of his lungs. His burned hands screamed in protest as they wrenched his arms behind his back and secured his wrists with restraints that felt like they were made of solid metal. Tom didn't resist. What would be the point? He'd just assaulted one of the most powerful nobles in the Galactic Court in front of hundreds of witnesses. There was no talking his way out of this, no claiming it was an accident or a misunderstanding. He'd grabbed that whip on purpose, and everyone had seen him do it. Lord Victor was screaming for Tom's immediate execution, his reptilian voice carrying across the entire Grand Hall. Kill him. Kill him now. This human filth dared to lay hands on me. He has violated every law of this court. I demand his death. But something strange was happening. Tom could hear it even as the guards hauled him to his feet and started dragging him toward the exit. The crowd that had been laughing moments before had gone quiet. Not completely silent, but subdued, uncertain. Some of them were staring at Tom with expressions he couldn't quite read. Others were looking at their communication devices, fingers moving rapidly across screens. Tom didn't understand what was happening until much later. He didn't know that 17 different beings in that crowd had recorded the entire incident. He didn't know that within 5 minutes, those recordings had been uploaded to galactic social networks. He didn't know that the footage of a human janitor grabbing an energy whip to stop the torture of a helpless servant was already starting to spread across hundreds of worlds at the speed of light. All Tom knew was pain, the burning agony of his hand, the bruises forming where the guards were gripping his arms, the copper taste of blood in his mouth from where his face had hit the floor. They dragged him out of the Grand Hall, through corridors he'd cleaned 100 times, down into levels of the court complex he'd never seen before. The detention center was deep underground, or what passed for underground in an artificial moon. The cells were small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with walls made of some kind of energy field that hummed constantly and made Tom's teeth ache. There was a hard bench that served as a bed, a toilet that was just a hole in the floor, and nothing else. Not even a window or a screen to tell him what time it was. They threw Tom into the cell and sealed the energy field behind him. His burned hand was still throbbing, the pain so intense it made him nauseous. A medical drone had come by eventually, not to treat him out of kindness, but because they wanted him healthy enough to stand trial. The drone had sprayed something on his hand that numbed the pain and started the healing process, but it would take days before he could use it properly again. Tom sat on the hard bench and tried to process what he'd done. He'd thrown away his life for a being he didn't even know. He'd violated laws that had stood for thousands of years. He'd assaulted a noble who had every legal right to demand his execution. And for what? Silence was probably still being punished right now, and Tom's intervention had only delayed it by a few minutes. But even knowing all that, even sitting in this cell facing almost certain death, Tom couldn't bring himself to regret it. He'd seen something wrong, and he'd stopped it. For a moment, at least. That had to count for something. The hours crawled by. Tom had no way to tell time except by counting his heartbeats and the meals that were delivered through a slot in the energy field. Protein paste that tasted like cardboard, water that was slightly too warm. He ate mechanically, trying to keep his strength up for whatever was coming. On what Tom guessed was the second day, though it could have been the third, time was meaningless down here, everything changed. The energy field deactivated suddenly, and 2 guards entered his cell. For a horrible moment, Tom thought they'd come to execute him right there. But instead, they told him he had a visitor. They led him to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. Sitting in one of the chairs was a human woman Tom had never seen before. She looked to be in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and eyes that were sharp and assessing. She wore a formal suit that marked her as someone important, someone with actual authority. "Tom Hayes?" she asked as the guards pushed him into the chair across from her. "My name is Rebecca Wright. I'm a licensed galactic attorney, and I've been assigned to represent you." Tom stared at her in confusion. "The court gave me a lawyer?" "Not exactly," Rebecca said. She pulled out a tablet and started scrolling through documents. "The court was ready to execute you immediately without trial. That's standard procedure for servants who assault nobles. But something happened that they didn't expect. You went viral." "I what?" Rebecca turned the tablet so Tom could see the screen. It showed footage from the Grand Hall, the moment Tom had grabbed the whip. But it wasn't just one video. There were dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all showing the same event from different angles. And beneath each video were view counts that made Tom's head spin. Billions of views. Billions. "The footage spread faster than anything I've ever seen," Rebecca explained. "Within 6 hours, it had reached every major world in the galactic community. The comments sections exploded. Servant species were calling you a hero. Lower-class workers were demanding fair trials. Even some nobles were saying that maybe the punishment had gone too far." She swiped to another screen showing news headlines in multiple languages. Tom couldn't read most of them, but the ones in English made his stomach flip. "Human defends helpless servant. Janitor stands against torture. One man's courage challenges ancient law." "The court is facing massive public pressure," Rebecca continued. "They can't just execute you quietly now. Too many beings are watching. So they've agreed to give you a trial. A real trial, with legal representation and everything." Tom's burned hand throbbed as he tried to process this information. "So, I might not die." Rebecca's expression was grim. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The law is very, very clear on this point, Tom. A servant who physically touches a noble without permission can be executed. That's been the law for over 5,000 years. You didn't just touch Lord Victor, you grabbed his weapon while he was legally disciplining his property. The evidence is overwhelming. Every legal precedent is against us. Then what's the point of a trial?" "The point," Rebecca said carefully, "is to buy time. To keep you alive long enough for public opinion to maybe shift things in our direction. And to set legal precedents that might help others in the future, even if we can't save you." The bluntness of her words hit Tom like a physical blow. He was probably going to die. This lawyer was basically telling him that her job was to delay his execution, not prevent it. He thought about his parents back on Earth, about his younger sister who'd been so proud when he got the job at the court. They'd find out their son had been executed on some alien moon for assaulting a noble. "There is one possibility," Rebecca said, leaning forward. "It's a long shot, and it's based on a legal precedent so old that most modern attorneys don't even know it exists. But I found it while researching your case, and it might be our only chance." "What is it?" "It's called the right of challenge. According to ancient court law, if someone from a servant class commits a crime against a noble, they can challenge that noble to ritual combat. If the servant wins, all charges are dropped. If they lose, the punishment is carried out immediately." Tom looked down at his bandaged hand, then back at Rebecca. "I'm a maintenance technician. I fix air filters and unclog drains. Lord Victor is a trained warrior who's probably been fighting for centuries. How is that fair?" "It's not fair," Rebecca admitted. "It was never meant to be fair. The law was created to give nobles an entertaining way to punish servants who got uppity. The servant always loses, and the noble gets to demonstrate their superiority in front of a crowd. It's barbaric. Then why would we invoke it? Because it's our only option. And because the challenge doesn't have to be physical combat. According to the law, it can be any form of competition that both parties agree to. The noble gets to choose the type of challenge, but the servant can propose alternatives, and the noble is honor-bound to at least consider them." Tom thought about this. "So if we can convince Lord Victor to agree to some kind of competition that plays to human strengths instead of his, then you might have a chance," Rebecca finished. "A small chance. But it's better than certain execution." "What kind of competition would work?" Rebecca pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table. "That's what we need to figure out. We have 3 days before the trial begins. 3 days to research everything we can about human capabilities, about what makes your species unique. 3 days to find something, anything, that could give you an advantage against a being who's stronger, faster, and has about 200 years of combat experience." Tom looked at the documents, at the legal precedents and case studies that Rebecca had compiled. His hands still hurt. His body was covered in bruises. He was exhausted and scared and facing almost certain death. But Rebecca was here. She was trying. And somehow, impossibly, billions of beings across the galaxy were watching and caring about what happened to one human janitor who'd grabbed a whip. "Okay," Tom said. "Let's figure this out. What do humans have that other species don't?" Rebecca smiled slightly. It wasn't a happy smile, but it was determined. "That's exactly the right question. And I think I might have some ideas." She started laying out her research, and for the first time since being thrown in this cell, Tom felt something that might have been hope. It was a fragile thing, easily crushed, but it was there. He was going to fight. He was going to challenge Lord Victor. And maybe, just maybe, he was going to survive. The trial had been held in the Grand Hall, the same place where Tom had grabbed the whip. Lord Victor had presented his case with absolute confidence, citing laws that were older than human civilization. The evidence was overwhelming, dozens of videos showing Tom's assault from every possible angle. The legal precedents were clear. According to 5,000 years of court law, servants who touched nobles without permission could be executed, and there was no wiggle room for interpretation. Rebecca had done her best to mount a defense, arguing about humanitarian principles and natural rights and the inherent dignity of all conscious beings. But every argument she made was shot down by the judges. Those concepts didn't exist in court law. Servants were property, and property had no rights. Then, in front of the packed courtroom and billions of viewers watching across the galaxy, Rebecca had invoked the right of challenge. The courtroom had gone silent. Even the judges had looked surprised, pulling up ancient legal databases to verify that such a law actually existed. It took them 20 minutes of searching through dusty digital archives before they confirmed it. Yes, the right of challenge was technically still valid, never officially repealed, just forgotten because it was so rarely used. Lord Victor had laughed when he heard about it. Actually laughed, his reptilian features twisted in amusement. "The human wants to fight me? This is perfect. I'll crush him in front of everyone, and then we can be done with this ridiculous trial." But Rebecca had been ready for this. According to the law, Lord Victor, the challenge doesn't have to be physical combat. It can be any form of competition that both parties agree to. My client proposes an endurance test. Endurance? Lord Victor had scoffed. What kind of warrior's challenge is that? A continuous obstacle course, Rebecca explained calmly. Both competitors start at the same time and repeat the course as many times as they can until one of them collapses or surrenders. No breaks, no rest periods, no time limits. Just pure endurance. The one who can keep going longer wins. The crowd had murmured at this suggestion. Some were intrigued. Others thought it sounded boring compared to traditional combat. Lord Victor had looked at his advisors, who'd whispered in his ear for a few minutes before he turned back with a cruel smile. "I accept," he'd announced. "I'll enjoy watching this pathetic human collapse after a few circuits while I'm barely even winded. It will be a fitting demonstration of why servants should know their place." That had been 3 days ago. Now, Tom stood at the entrance to the court's arena, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The arena was a massive space, usually used for sporting events and demonstrations. Today, it had been transformed into an obstacle course that looked like something out of a nightmare. The course was brutal by design. It started with a 20-foot climbing wall with minimal handholds. At the top, competitors had to navigate a series of balance beams suspended 15 feet in the air, fall off, and you'd have to start the whole section over. After the beams came a section where you had to carry heavy sandbags up and down a steep ramp. Then there were monkey bars across a gap, a tunnel to crawl through, a wall to vault over, and a series of mental puzzles that had to be solved while your body was screaming from exhaustion. The entire circuit was designed to take about 15 to 20 minutes for an average competitor to complete. And they'd have to keep doing it over and over until someone collapsed. Tom stood there in simple workout clothes, shorts and a t-shirt that the court had provided. His burned hand was mostly healed now thanks to the medical treatments they'd given him, but it still ached when he flexed it. Across the arena floor, Lord Victor was doing warm-up stretches, his massive reptilian body moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator. The arena was packed. Every seat was filled with spectators who'd come to watch this unprecedented event. And Tom knew that billions more were watching via broadcast across the galaxy. The footage would be analyzed, shared, turned into commentary and debate. He wasn't just fighting for his own life, he'd somehow become a symbol of something bigger. Rebecca approached him one last time before the start. Remember what we talked about, she said quietly. Don't try to match his speed. He's faster than you, stronger than you, and he'll complete each circuit quicker. That's fine. That's expected. Your job is just to keep moving. Steady pace. Consistent breathing. Don't burn out early trying to keep up. I remember, Tom said. His mouth was dry despite drinking water all morning. Slow and steady. Like running a marathon. Exactly. You ran marathons back on Earth, right? Yeah. Finished 3 of them. Never won any medals, but I always finished. That's all you need to do today. Just finish. Keep finishing. Keep going when his body starts to fail. Rebecca squeezed his shoulder. You can do this, Tom. Humans are built for endurance in ways most species aren't. Trust your biology. The judge, a floating jellyfish-like being who served as referee, announced the rules. Both competitors would start simultaneously. They would repeat the course as many times as they could. If either competitor failed to complete an obstacle 3 times in a row, they were disqualified. If either competitor collapsed, surrendered, or couldn't continue, the other won automatically. There was no time limit. Tom took his position at the starting line. Lord Victor stood beside him, towering over him by at least 2 feet. The reptilian noble looked down at Tom with undisguised contempt. This will be over quickly, human, Lord Victor said. I'll complete 10 circuits before you finish 5. Then I'll watch you collapse, and I'll finally get the execution I was promised. Tom didn't respond. He focused on his breathing, on the rhythm he'd need to maintain, on the voice of his old track coach from high school who taught him how to pace himself for long distances. The starting signal sounded, a loud tone that echoed through the arena. Lord Victor exploded forward like he'd been shot from a cannon. His powerful legs propelled him to the climbing wall in seconds. He scaled it with ridiculous ease, his clawed hands and feet finding purchase on holds that Tom would struggle to reach. By the time Tom had jogged to the base of the wall and started climbing, Lord Victor was already on the balance beams. The crowd cheered as Lord Victor moved across the beams with perfect balance, his tail providing counterweight that made it look easy. Tom reached the top of the climbing wall, his arms already burning from the effort, and carefully made his way onto the first beam. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his center of gravity low. Lord Victor had already finished the balance beams and was loading sandbags onto his shoulders by the time Tom made it halfway across. The reptilian noble hoisted weights that probably weighed 100 pounds each and carried them up the ramp like they were nothing. Tom finished the beams and moved to the sandbags. He chose lighter weights, maybe 50 pounds, and started up the ramp. His legs protested immediately, quadriceps burning with the effort. But he kept his breathing steady, in through his nose, out through his mouth, the way his coach had taught him. Lord Victor completed the first circuit in just under 8 minutes. He crossed the finish line with barely a hint of exertion, laughing and waving to the crowd. Then he immediately started the second circuit, attacking the climbing wall with the same explosive energy. Tom finished his first circuit at 14 minutes. He was already sweating, already feeling the strain in his muscles. But his breathing was controlled, his heart rate was steady, and he knew from experience that this was just the warm-up. Real endurance didn't start until your body thought it was done and you had to convince it to keep going anyway. The second circuit was more of the same. Lord Victor finished in 7.5 minutes, moving even faster now that he knew the course. He was clearly showing off, doing unnecessary flourishes on the balance beams, carrying heavier sandbags than required. Tom finished at 15 minutes, his pace slightly slower but still consistent. By the third circuit, Lord Victor was fully into showboating mode. He paused at the top of the climbing wall to wave at the crowd. He did a handstand on one of the balance beams just to prove he could. He carried the heaviest sandbags available up and down the ramp multiple times. His circuit time was actually slower because of all the showing off, 9 minutes, but he clearly wasn't concerned. He was making a point about his superiority. Tom just kept moving. Circuit 3 at 15.5 minutes. His shirt was soaked with sweat now, clinging to his body. His hands were starting to get sore from gripping the climbing holds. But his breathing was still controlled, still rhythmic. He was in the zone now, that mental state where the discomfort faded into background noise and your body just became a machine that kept moving forward. Circuit 4. Lord Victor at 8 minutes, looking like he was barely trying. Tom at 16 minutes, starting to slow just slightly but still consistent. Circuit 5. Lord Victor at 7 minutes 45 seconds, his fastest time yet. Tom at 16.5 minutes. The crowd was getting bored. Some were checking their communication devices. Others were having conversations. This wasn't the exciting combat they'd expected. It was just two beings running an obstacle course, and one of them was clearly dominating while the other plodded along slowly. But Rebecca, watching from the sidelines, was smiling. Because she could see what the crowd couldn't. She could see that Lord Victor's breathing was getting heavier. She could see that his movements, while still fast, weren't quite as fluid as they'd been at the start. She could see the first signs of fatigue starting to show in his body language. Circuit 6. Circuit 7. Circuit 8. Lord Victor was still faster, still completing each circuit in less time than Tom. But his times were no longer improving. In fact, they were starting to get slightly slower. 8.5 minutes. 9 minutes. 9 minutes 30 seconds. Tom's times, meanwhile, had stabilized. 16 to 17 minutes per circuit, consistent across every lap. His pace hadn't changed since the beginning. Slow and steady, like a machine that didn't know how to stop. By circuit 10, Lord Victor wasn't laughing anymore. His breathing had become audibly labored, his chest heaving with each breath. Reptilian species like the Dravians were built for explosive power, short bursts of incredible strength and speed. But sustained endurance? That wasn't their evolutionary strength. Tom kept moving. His whole body ached now. His hands were raw and bleeding from the climbing wall. His legs felt like lead weights. But he'd run through this kind of pain before in marathons, had learned that the body almost always had more to give than the mind thought possible. Circuit 15. Lord Victor's time had slowed to 12 minutes. He was no longer showboating, no longer waving to the crowd. He was focused entirely on just finishing each obstacle, his movements mechanical and strained. Tom finished at 17 minutes, his pace barely changed from his first circuit. Circuit 20. Lord Victor at 14 minutes, nearly stumbling on the balance beams. Tom at 17.5 minutes, still going. The crowd had gone quiet now. They were starting to realize what was happening. The human wasn't just surviving, he was winning through sheer relentless endurance. Lord Victor's superior speed and strength didn't matter anymore because his body was shutting down from exhaustion while Tom just kept going like some kind of unstoppable machine. Lord Victor had collapsed on circuit 63. Tom had watched it happen, had seen the massive reptilian noble's legs finally give out completely as he tried to climb the wall one more time. Victor's clawed hands had slipped from the holds, and he'd fallen to the padded floor below, his body refusing to respond no matter how much his pride demanded he continue. The medical team had rushed in immediately, checking his vital signs, confirming what everyone already knew, he was done. His body had nothing left to give. Tom had completed circuit 64 just to make his point, though honestly he could have kept going. His body was screaming, every muscle burning, his hands bleeding through the bandages, but his breathing was still controlled, still steady. He'd run ultramarathons back on Earth that had lasted longer than this. He knew he could do at least a dozen more circuits if he needed to. But he didn't need to. The judges had declared him the winner. The charges were dropped. According to the ancient law of the right of challenge, Tom Hayes was now a free man. The arena had erupted in chaos. Half the crowd was cheering, stunned by what they'd witnessed. The other half was shouting in outrage, refusing to believe that a human janitor had just defeated one of the court's most powerful nobles. Security had to escort Tom out quickly before the situation turned violent, with Rebecca Wright running alongside him, her face split in a grin of disbelief and triumph. That had been 2 months ago, and the shockwaves were still spreading. Tom sat in the small office he'd set up in what used to be an abandoned warehouse on the lower levels of the court complex. The space wasn't much, concrete walls, basic furniture, flickering overhead lights that he kept meaning to fix, but it was his. Through the window, he could see dozens of beings moving around the main floor, servants from across the galaxy who'd found their way here seeking help. His communication device buzzed constantly with messages. News outlets wanting interviews. Political groups wanting him to speak at rallies. Marketing companies offering him endorsement deals that would have made him rich beyond his wildest dreams. Tom ignored most of them. He hadn't grabbed that whip to become famous. He'd done it because it was the right thing to do, and the attention that came afterward was more burden than blessing. What he couldn't ignore was the impact his victory had created across galactic society. Within a week of the challenge, protests had started on 3 different worlds, servants gathering in public spaces, holding signs demanding rights and protections. Within 2 weeks, it had spread to a dozen worlds. By the end of the first month, there were demonstrations happening on over 50 planets, involving hundreds of different servant species. The message was always the same: if a human janitor could stand up to a noble and win, why couldn't they? If the supposedly weak and primitive humans refused to accept abuse, Why should servants who'd been oppressed for thousands of years continue to bow their heads and take it? The galactic elite had tried to suppress the protests at first. They deployed security forces, passed emergency laws making servant gatherings illegal, and launched propaganda campaigns claiming that Tom's victory was a fluke, an aberration that didn't change the fundamental order of society. Some nobles hired thugs to intimidate protesters, beating them in alleys and threatening their families. But the servants kept protesting. And more importantly, they'd learned something from watching Tom, that their invisibility could be a weapon. Servants worked everywhere, saw everything, had access to places and information that their masters didn't even think about. When they decided to act, they were surprisingly effective. Assassins sent to kill protest leaders found their food poisoned by servant cooks. Security forces found their vehicles sabotaged by servant mechanics. Communications meant to coordinate crackdowns were leaked by servant technicians who had access to supposedly secure networks. The very beings that the elite had dismissed as harmless property turned out to be dangerous when they decided to fight back. Tom hadn't asked for any of this. After the trial, he'd honestly tried to just go back to his normal life. He'd shown up at the maintenance department the next day, ready to get back to fixing air filters and cleaning floors. But the supervisor had taken one look at him and shaken his head. "Can't employ you anymore, Tom," the supervisor had said, not unkindly. "You're too famous now. Your presence causes disruptions. Half the staff wants your autograph, and the other half is terrified you're going to start some kind of revolution in the maintenance department. The court administration wants you gone." So Tom had found himself unemployed, famous, and with no clear idea what to do next. That's when he'd started thinking about silence. The young whisper had been freed by Lord Victor the day after the challenge. Keeping silence as property would have been a constant reminder of Victor's humiliation, and the noble's pride couldn't handle that. So he'd simply released silence with nothing, no money, no possessions, no skills beyond serving nobles, and nowhere to go. Tom had found silence sleeping in a service corridor 3 days after their freedom, curled up in a corner, looking lost and terrified. When Tom approached, silence had flinched away at first, probably expecting more abuse. But Tom had sat down beside them, moving slowly and carefully, and had used the basic sign language he'd been learning. "It's okay," Tom had signed. "You're safe now. Do you have somewhere to go?" Silence had shaken their head, tears forming in those large eyes. "Do you want help?" Tom had signed. Silence had nodded so vigorously their whole body shook. That had been the beginning. Tom had used the small amount of money he'd saved from his janitor job to rent a cheap room where Silence could stay. But word had spread quickly. There was a human helping freed servants, actually helping them instead of just giving speeches or making donations to feel good about themselves. Within a week, 3 more freed servants had shown up asking for help. Within 2 weeks, it was 10. Within a month, Tom was overwhelmed. That's when Rebecca had stepped in. The lawyer had taken on Tom's case for the publicity initially, but somewhere along the way, she'd actually started to believe in what he represented. She'd helped him establish a legal framework for what they were calling the sanctuary, a place where freed servants could come to get housing, food, and most importantly, training in skills that could help them build independent lives. "You can't just free people and expect them to thrive," Rebecca had explained to Tom during one of their planning meetings. "Most of these beings have been servants their entire lives. They don't know how to make decisions for themselves, how to handle money, how to negotiate for fair wages. We need to teach them everything." The sanctuary had started in that abandoned warehouse, with Tom and Rebecca and a handful of volunteers trying to help a dozen freed servants. Now, 2 months later, they were housing over 200 beings from 40 different species, with more arriving every day. Tom walked through the main floor of the warehouse, watching the organized chaos of daily operations. In one corner, a teacher, a freed servant who'd once worked in a noble's private school, was conducting basic literacy classes. In another area, vocational trainers were teaching practical skills like equipment repair, cooking, and data entry. A medical clinic operated out of a partitioned section, staffed by volunteer doctors who treated the physical and psychological trauma that most freed servants carried. Silence found Tom near the entrance, signing rapidly. They'd become close over the past weeks, with Silence serving as Tom's assistant and helping other whispers who came to the sanctuary. The young being was completely different from the terrified creature Tom had first protected. More confident, more engaged, actually smiling sometimes. 3 more arrived this morning, Silence signed. They walked here from the transport station. They said they saw your challenge on the networks and decided to leave their masters. Tom signed back. "Do we have space for them?" "Barely. We're at capacity. Rebecca says we need to find a larger location soon. That was the constant problem. The sanctuary was successful beyond anything Tom had imagined, but success meant more people needing help than they had resources to provide. They were operating on donations and volunteer labor, and while support had been generous from lower-class beings across the galaxy, it was never quite enough. Tom's communication device buzzed again. This time he checked it because the message was from Rebecca. Turn on the news. Now. Tom pulled up a news feed on one of the displays in the office. The headline made his stomach drop. Servant rights demonstration turns violent on Corvin Prime. 47 dead. The footage showed chaos, servants marching peacefully through a city square when security forces opened fire with energy weapons. Bodies falling. Crowds scattering in panic. Buildings burning. The reporter's voice described how local authorities had declared the demonstration illegal and decided to restore order through lethal force. Tom felt sick. 47 dead. Beings who'd been inspired by his example, who'd thought that standing up for their rights was possible because a human janitor had grabbed a whip. And now they were dead because the system refused to change. His device buzzed again. Another message from Rebecca. Emergency meeting. My office. 1 hour. Bring silence. Tom found silence and explained what had happened. The young whisper's face went pale, their hands trembling as they signed, "This is my fault. If I hadn't spilled that wine, if I hadn't been punished, you never would have grabbed the whip. Those people would still be alive." "No," Tom signed firmly. "This is not your fault. This is the fault of a system that treats people as property. This is the fault of nobles who think they can murder beings who ask for basic dignity. Don't ever think this is on you." They made their way to Rebecca's office in the legal district of the court complex. When they arrived, they found Rebecca wasn't alone. There were 5 other beings in the room, representatives from major servant advocacy groups that had formed in the wake of Tom's victory. "We need to talk about what happens next," Rebecca said without preamble. "The massacre on Corvin Prime has changed everything. The galactic elite is scared. They're cracking down hard on protests, passing new laws, deploying military forces. But they've also created martyrs. Those 47 dead servants are rallying the movement like nothing else could have." One of the representatives, a being with blue skin and 4 arms named Patricia, spoke up. "The question is whether we push forward or pull back. Do we escalate the protests, or do we try to negotiate some kind of peaceful resolution?" "The elite won't negotiate," another representative said. "They'll only respond to force." "We don't have force," Rebecca countered. "We have numbers and moral authority, but in a direct confrontation, they have armies and weapons that could eliminate servant populations if they felt truly threatened." Tom had been quiet, listening to the debate. Finally, he spoke. "What if we don't protest? What if we just stop?" Everyone turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" Rebecca asked. "I mean servants stop working. All of them, everywhere, all at once. No violence, no confrontation. Just stop cooking their food, stop cleaning their buildings, stop maintaining their equipment, stop doing all the invisible labor that keeps their society functioning. How long could the elite last without servants?" The room went silent as everyone considered this. "A general strike," Patricia said slowly. "Across the entire galaxy." "It's never been done before," Rebecca said. "Coordinating something like that across hundreds of worlds, thousands of servant populations." "But if we could pull it off," another representative finished, "it would demonstrate our power without giving them an excuse to massacre us. What are they going to do, execute everyone? Their entire civilization would collapse." The debate went on for hours, but the seed had been planted. A general strike. The ultimate demonstration that servants weren't property, they were the foundation on which galactic civilization was built. And if that foundation decided to stop supporting the structure above it, the whole thing would come crashing down. Tom left the meeting exhausted, his mind spinning with possibilities and fears. As he in silence walked back to the sanctuary, he thought about those 47 dead on Corvin Prime. About all the beings who'd suffered under the system of servitude. About Silence, who'd been beaten for spilling wine. He'd grabbed a whip 2 months ago without thinking about the consequences. Now he was helping plan what might become the largest act of civil disobedience in galactic history. He was just a janitor from Ohio who'd thought the galaxy might be an adventure. Instead, he'd accidentally started a revolution. And now he had to see it through, wherever it led. The general strike began exactly 3 weeks after the massacre on Corvin Prime. It started quietly, without fanfare or dramatic announcements. Servants across the galaxy simply stopped working. They put down their tools, stepped away from their stations, and walked out of the homes and buildings and facilities they'd been maintaining for thousands of years. On the first day, the galactic elite barely noticed. A few nobles complained that their breakfast wasn't prepared on time or that their floors hadn't been cleaned. Some businesses were annoyed that their maintenance staff hadn't shown up. But most assumed it was just local problems, individual servants being lazy or difficult. They'd deal with it later. By the second day, the reality started to sink in. This wasn't a local problem. This was happening everywhere, on every world, in every city. Restaurants had no cooks. Hospitals had no orderlies. Spaceports had no ground crews. The massive infrastructure that kept galactic civilization running was grinding to a halt because the beings who actually did the work had decided to stop. By the third day, there was panic. Tom watched the news feeds from the sanctuary, seeing reports flood in from across the galaxy. Power grids failing because no one was maintaining the equipment. Water treatment plants shutting down because the operators had walked away. Garbage piling up in streets because collection crews had vanished. The elite were discovering what Tom had known all along. Servants weren't just property or decorations. They were the foundation that everything else was built on. The galactic government called an emergency session of the council. Lord Victor was there, his humiliation from the challenge temporarily forgotten as he and other nobles demanded immediate action. Send in the military, he shouted. Force them back to work. Execute the leaders. Make an example that will terrify the rest into submission. But Emperor Nathan, the Corthan ruler who'd been quietly sympathetic to the servant rights movement, stood up and spoke with a voice that silenced the chamber. And who will operate your military equipment when the servant technicians refuse to work? Who will cook food for your soldiers when the servant cooks walk away? Who will process the fuel for your ships when the servant refinery workers stop showing up? You can't force billions of beings to work at gunpoint. The moment you try, the moment you start executing strikers, is the moment your entire civilization collapses completely. The council chamber had gone silent at that. Because Nathan was right, and everyone knew it. The elite had built their power on the backs of servants they dismissed as insignificant. Now those servants were demonstrating just how much power they actually held. Rebecca was coordinating the strike from a secure location, using encrypted communications to stay in touch with servant groups across hundreds of worlds. She'd update Tom daily on the progress, and the news was always the same: the strike was holding. Despite threats, despite bribes, despite propaganda campaigns claiming the servants were being manipulated by outside forces, they weren't going back to work. How long can they hold out? Tom asked during one of their strategy meetings. These people have no savings, no resources. They need food and shelter just like everyone else. That's what the Sanctuary Network is for, Rebecca explained. She pulled up a map showing dozens of locations across multiple worlds. We've established supply lines, safe houses, places where strikers can get what they need. The donations are pouring in from lower-class beings who support what we're doing. Even some moderate nobles are quietly contributing because they know the current system is unsustainable. Tom looked at the map, at the network they'd built in just a few weeks. It was impressive, but it also felt fragile. All it would take was one major crack, one group of strikers breaking ranks, and the whole thing could fall apart. The crack came on day 12 of the strike, but not in the way Tom expected. Lord Victor had been planning his revenge carefully. He'd spent the week since his defeat gathering mercenaries, hiring the most violent and ruthless beings he could find. He'd sold off assets, called in favors, spent his entire remaining fortune on building a private army. And he'd decided that if he couldn't defeat Tom in legal combat, he'd simply destroy everything Tom had built. The attack on the sanctuary came at dawn. Tom had been in his office going over supply lists when the first explosion hit. The blast tore through the eastern wall of the warehouse, killing 3 volunteers instantly and injuring a dozen more. Before Tom could even process what was happening, mercenaries were pouring through the breach, firing weapons indiscriminately at anyone they saw. Tom ran toward the main floor where most of the freed servants were sleeping. He could hear screams, could smell smoke and burning metal. His mind was racing. They needed to evacuate, needed to get people out before the entire building came down. But more explosions were hitting other parts of the warehouse, cutting off escape routes, trapping people inside. This way. Tom shouted, directing a group of terrified whispers toward a service exit he knew about. He could see mercenaries advancing through the smoke, their armor making them look like mechanical monsters. These weren't security forces bound by rules of engagement. These were killers who'd been paid to eliminate everyone in the building. Silence appeared at Tom's side, their face streaked with ash and blood from a cut on their forehead. They signed frantically, "Victor is here. Is leading them personally. He says he's going to kill you in front of everyone." Tom felt a cold determination settle over him. Of course Victor was here. This had always been personal for the noble. It wasn't about law or justice or even the servant rights movement. It was about ego, about a powerful being who couldn't accept being defeated by someone he considered inferior. "Get everyone you can to the underground tunnels," Tom signed to Silence. "There's an old maintenance access that leads to the lower levels. The mercenaries won't know about it." "What about you?" Silence signed, their hands shaking. "I'm going to buy you time," Tom said aloud. He didn't know how to sign what he was planning, and he wasn't sure Silence would understand anyway. Tom ran toward the center of the warehouse, toward where he could see the heaviest concentration of mercenaries. And there, directing the attack with savage satisfaction, was Lord Victor. The reptilian noble had abandoned any pretense of dignity or honor. He was wearing combat armor and wielding an energy rifle, personally shooting at fleeing servants like they were targets in a training exercise. "Victor!" Tom shouted, his voice somehow carrying over the chaos. "This is between us. Let them go and fight me." Lord Victor's head snapped around, his yellow eyes locking onto Tom. A smile spread across his reptilian features, showing all those sharp teeth. "Finally. I was hoping you'd be stupid enough to face me directly." The noble gestured to his mercenaries, who immediately stopped advancing and formed a circle around Tom and Victor. This was what their employer had paid them for, not just to kill everyone, but to give him a chance to personally destroy the human who'd humiliated him. Tom stood in the center of that circle, unarmed and exhausted, facing a being who was bigger, stronger, and armed with military-grade weapons. Every logical part of his brain was screaming that this was suicide. But he'd bought time for Silence and the others to escape, and that was worth it. "You know what your problem is, human?" Lord Victor said, slowly advancing. "You actually believe that your pathetic gesture of grabbing my whip meant something. You think you started a movement, changed society, made a difference." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "All you did was delay the inevitable. Servants are property. They always have been. They always will be. And I'm going to prove it by mounting your head on my wall." Tom didn't respond to the speech. He was too busy analyzing the situation, looking for any advantage he could find. The mercenaries surrounding them were watching but not intervening. This was Victor's show. The warehouse was burning, but not collapsed yet. And most importantly, he could see freed servants moving in the shadows behind the mercenaries, getting into position for something. It took Tom a moment to realize what was happening. The freed servants weren't running away. They were staying to fight. Beings who'd spent their entire lives being beaten down, being told they were worthless property, were choosing to stand up. They were grabbing tools and improvised weapons, coordinating through quick gestures and signs, preparing to attack the mercenaries from behind. Tom needed to keep Victor's attention focused on him, needed to buy them time to get into position. So he did the only thing he could think of, he talked. "You're right about one thing," Tom said. "I'm not special. I'm just a janitor who saw something wrong and couldn't look away. But that's exactly why you're going to lose, Victor. Because if someone as ordinary as me can stand up to you, then anyone can. You're not fighting one human anymore. You're fighting an idea, and you can't kill ideas with energy rifles." Victor roared in rage and fired his weapon. Tom dove to the side, the energy blast missing him by inches and burning a hole in the concrete floor where he'd been standing. He rolled, came up running, putting one of the warehouse's support pillars between himself and the noble. "Stand still and die like the inferior being you are." Victor screamed, firing again. The blast hit the pillar, making the whole structure shake. Tom kept moving, kept Victor chasing him around the warehouse floor. And while the noble was focused entirely on killing him, the freed servants struck. They hit the mercenaries from behind in a coordinated wave, using the element of surprise to overcome their lack of weapons and training. It wasn't elegant or professional, but it was effective. Mercenaries went down under swarms of beings they'd been paid to kill, their armor and weapons not enough to save them from sheer numbers and desperate courage. Victor realized what was happening too late. He turned to see his mercenary force collapsing, his paid killers being overwhelmed by the very servants he'd come here to eliminate. His expression shifted from rage to something Tom had never seen before on the noble's face: fear. "No," Victor said, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. "This isn't possible. You're servants. You're property. You can't." "We're people," Tom said quietly. He'd circled around during the chaos and was now standing between Victor and the only exit. That's what you never understood. That's what this whole revolution has been about. Not power or revenge or even rights, really. Just recognition that we're people. All of us. Human, Whisper, Dravian, every species in this galaxy. We're all just people trying to survive and build lives worth living. Silence appeared beside Tom, joined by dozens of other freed servants. They formed a line between Victor and Escape, their faces showing a mix of fear and determination. They were done running. Victor looked at them, at the army of beings he'd considered worthless property, and something in him broke. He fell to his knees, his massive reptilian body collapsing under the weight of understanding that his entire worldview had been wrong. Everything he'd believed about natural hierarchy and inferior beings had been built on a lie, and facing that truth was destroying him more thoroughly than any physical defeat could have. Emperor Nathan arrived with actual military forces an hour later, responding to distress calls from the sanctuary. He found the mercenaries bound and disarmed, the freed servants providing medical aid to the wounded, and Lord Victor sitting in the middle of the warehouse floor staring at nothing. The Emperor surveyed the scene, taking in the damage and the casualties, and then approached Tom. "The strike has been going for 12 days, Nathan said. Civilization is on the verge of collapse. The Council is ready to negotiate. What are your terms?" Tom looked at Silence, at Rebecca who'd just arrived, at the hundreds of freed servants who'd risked their lives to fight back. Basic rights for all servants. Legal protections against abuse. The ability to earn freedom through reasonable terms. Recognition as people under galactic law. And most importantly, no retaliation against anyone who participated in the strike. Nathan nodded slowly. "The Council won't like it." "The Council doesn't have a choice," Rebecca interjected. "Their civilization has been shut down for almost 2 weeks. They'll agree to anything to get services restored." The Servant Protection Act was passed 3 days later. It wasn't perfect, true equality was still a distant goal, but it fundamentally changed the legal status of billions of beings across the galaxy. Servants were officially recognized as people with basic rights. They couldn't be tortured or killed without trial. They could buy their freedom under standardized terms. And most importantly, they could organize and advocate for themselves without being executed for it. Tom continued running the Sanctuary network, which grew to include locations on 4 to 7 different worlds. He remained deliberately out of the spotlight, letting others become the political faces of the movement. But he trained new generations of activists, helped establish schools and job training programs, and worked to heal the damage that thousands of years of servitude had created. 5 years after grabbing that energy whip, Tom was invited to the Grand Hall for a ceremony. The court wanted to honor his contributions to galactic society with titles and official positions. He'd declined all of those offers, but he'd agreed to one request, that they build a memorial. The memorial was erected on the exact spot where Tom had grabbed the whip, where this whole chain of events had begun. It showed a simple image carved in stone, a hand reaching out, not in violence but in protection. And beneath it, words in every major galactic language. Evil triumphs when good people do nothing. Tom stood at the unveiling ceremony with Silence beside him, surrounded by thousands of freed servants who'd built new lives. He looked at the memorial and thought about that moment 5 years ago when he'd acted without thinking, when he just grabbed a whip because someone was being hurt and he couldn't look away. He'd been told his entire life that one person couldn't make a difference, that systems were too big and too old to change. But he grabbed a whip anyway. And somehow, impossibly, it had been enough. Not because he was special or heroic or destined for greatness. But because sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to look away when everyone else does. One person saying no when everyone else stays silent. One person grabbing a whip and deciding that enough is enough. Tom Hayes was just a janitor from Ohio. But he'd reminded the galaxy that ordinary people doing the right thing at the right moment can reshape the universe. And that, in the end, was the most extraordinary thing of all.